morning. I'm going to tell you a story of my life, well, part of my life anyway. I won't bore you with all the details. It's how open textbooks derailed my physics career, and how I think that they're going to fundamentally revolutionize education in South Africa. They fundamentally altered my life, and it's kind of fitting that I tell this story here because it actually started here in Grahamstown. In Grahamstown every year there's a science festival held for schools. It's very large, 70,000+ people come to it. It takes a whole week. It's quite an affair, and it's really good. In 2002, I was studying for my master's degree in laser physics at the University of Cape Town, UCT, and I was convinced to volunteer to be part of the UCT presence at the Science Festival that year. And we had a very large presence, 10 stations, each manned by a representative from a different department within the science faculty at UCT, and I got the physics stand. The theme that year was seeing the world through science. And at the first stand, I would explain some of the fundamental properties of waves, that they interfere, that they can reflect, things like that. Because the stations that came subsequent to me would use those features, telescopes, microscopes. They take advantage of these features of the wave properties of light. And what happens at the Science Festival, which is really good, is that a lot of buses are sponsored to bring learners from the under-resourced schools in the area. There are many schools that are very, very poor in the Eastern Cape, around Grahamstown. And these learners are brought to the Science Festival, and it's quite an experience for them. And they go around in groups, and sometimes with a translator, because English may be their second, third, or even fourth language. And things changed for me when a group of these learners, who'd been subjected to my presentation the previous day, returned. What they'd done was they'd pooled their meager financial resources, gone and bought a notebook at the local CNA and a pen, and they came to me and they gave it to me, and they had a simple request. They just asked if I would write down everything I'd explained the previous day about waves, interfering, diffracting, etc. Because, they said, they didn't have any textbooks in their school. Their teacher wasn't going to explain this content to them. They said that their teacher didn't understand it. But they wanted to know it because they were in grade 12, the final year of high school, and it's in the exam at the end of the year for physical sciences. So before we carry on with the story, I think it's important to note at this point that within the under-resourced schools of South Africa, and probably everywhere in the world, there is a willingness, even a hunger to learn, that's crushed daily by circumstance. And that's quite frankly unacceptable. So I took their notebook, and during my lunch break, I went and I sat and I started to write things down. But if you stop and think about it for a moment, it's clearly a futile exercise. What am I going to write down in an hour and a half that's going to have a real impact on their lives? Waves is one of the simpler sections, I would argue, in the physics curriculum taught at school. So if their teacher hasn't explained waves to them and they don't have a textbook, what else is missing? We expressed physics and the chemistry and the physical sciences curriculum in the language of mathematics. If they went to a school that had an unqualified science teacher and no science textbooks, what are the chances they have a qualified maths teacher and maths textbooks? I don't know the answer, but I'm not going to put any money on it. So we actually have to write down all of that content. Writing a little bit about waves is not going to have a real impact on their lives whatsoever. So that's what we wanted to do. That's what I tried to do. I tried to free up that content because I fundamentally believe that the fact that waves interfere and reflect and diffract, that's been written down hundreds of thousands of times. It's been known for centuries. There are millions of people on this planet who know that, maybe even billions, I'm not sure, but definitely many millions, who could write that down. There's no reason that sort of information should be inaccessible to these learners. So they need it written down, but for it to be useful to them, it also has to be curriculum aligned. So the resources that currently exist, where that information is written down in a curriculum aligned manner, they're all locked behind all rights reserved copyright licenses. Makes it harder to do things with them. So what I decided to do was try to get people to help me to collaboratively author textbooks that we would just release freely and openly. I'll talk a little bit more about open in a second. And by and large, everyone thinks it's a good idea. Let's write free textbooks. How can that possibly be a bad idea? But most people think it's impossible. You'll never collaboratively author textbooks using volunteers. It's not going to happen. But graduate students are typically up for crazy ideas. So I managed to at least convince my cohort of grad students at the University of Cape Town to have a crack at this. Kind of convinced them we could do it in a weekend. We lock ourselves in a room, pizza, crank out the books, easy stuff. You can just write it down. So we did, but it took 5 years, not a weekend. And we used a community of volunteers across the globe. Over 100 people's names now sit at the front of those textbooks. Early in 2007, we've completed a set of mathematics and physical sciences textbooks that covers grade 10, 11, and 12 that are freely and openly available. Open, when we use it, means we're referring to open copyright licenses. An open copyright license is a copyright license that grants freedoms rather than imposing restrictions. So rather than starting with all rights reserved, it contains language like, you may copy this, you may take it, change it, adapt it, etc. Okay. So these books were openly licensed, and we put them up on a website. Our goal was to have massive impact in South Africa. Every learner was now going to have access to all of this information. Didn't quite happen, but we have some great anecdotes about impact that we did have. I'll give you 3 quick stories. Kulwana Radebe, the student in Soweto, sent us a testimonial, said, "You changed my life. I was failing mathematics. At best, I was going to get between 40 and 50% at the end of my matric year. I got all 3 of your textbooks, 10, 11, and 12 mathematics, worked through them from cover to cover, a couple of past papers, and got 79% for mathematics at the end of my matric year. That allowed me to get into the University of Johannesburg and study engineering." So I think that it's a life-altering experience to go to university if you might otherwise not have been able to. So that's great, and that probably justifies the entire exercise in its own right. Met a teacher, Grant Hillebrand, teaching at a small Christian school in Pietermaritzburg, Maritzburg Christian School, run out of a school hall. Very, very under-resourced private school. They negotiated with their local printer to print small copies of the books at cost so that they could get access to it. They saved over 100 Rand a book, and that's how that school ran their physical science classes. So that's a great story in its own right as well. We work with a group out of Rice University in Houston, Texas. They told us about a community college professor in the state of New York that was using our grade 10 statistics chapter as her introductory material in her course. It's also great. And all enabled by an open copyright license and encouraged. But not the widespread impact in South Africa that we really wanted to have. We wanted to put a book in the hands of every single learner. Now, there's only one organization that can actually do that. That's the government. And everyone thinks it's a great idea for the government to print openly licensed textbooks and distribute them to the country, but it's impossible. They'll never do that. But what I had achieved was sufficient credibility to get the Shuttleworth Foundation to invest in us going forward, because that was a purely volunteer project before that. And as part of the Shuttleworth Foundation, we worked very hard for a number of years to try to achieve this goal of widespread adoption of this openly licensed content. But it didn't really happen. But in every crisis, there's an opportunity. And this country was crippled by a huge public sector strike in 2010. Teachers took more than 3 weeks off, I don't know if you remember, and nurses, everybody. And literally, the phone rang in the office the one day. It was a representative from the Department of Basic Education. And they said, "We want to make some resources available because of the strike. Your books are free, we can do that, we'll put it up on the website. But we want you to edit them. And you have to do it in a week." So we had to edit 1,800 pages of content in 1 week. This is impossible. So we had to crack at it anyway. And we started turning people away once we'd reached 100 volunteers who on average were reading for their PhD in the field we wanted them to proofread. And we managed to do it. We edited all of that content in a week using a virtual community of volunteers. And that got those books released digitally by the Department of Basic Education and opened the door for us to spend 2011 working with the Department of Basic Education to prove that those books were good enough to print. And late 2011, they printed 2.5 million copies of openly licensed textbooks to be distributed to 1.8 million learners in this country. Every child who goes to a government school who takes maths or physical science in grade 10, 11, or 12 will have received an openly licensed textbook written by volunteers, edited by volunteers, under an open license. That thing that was impossible, we did that. Kind of cool. Not only that, while we were doing this, because this took many years, there's actually a global movement towards open educational resources. Videos, presentations, simulations, software being developed by projects all over the world. The books that were printed were not just curriculum-aligned textbooks for South Africa, but they're actually tour guides to a world of open educational resources that are available online. We brought the technology into the classroom by linking it directly into these textbooks. The print books look like traditional print books, but there are all these hooks. They're using open source software. The books are available on a website, so anybody can read them for free. We have, you can read that website on a mobile phone, not just a smartphone, low-end feature phones as well. And our books go out over Mixit, which is the chat client that the entire market knows about. You can read your maths or physical science textbook on Mixit. And within 4 days of launching it on Mixit, we had 150,000 people reading their maths or physical sciences textbook on Mixit, on a dinky little screen. And that's really exciting for us. So we've integrated the technology into teaching. We've integrated the technology into making those resources accessible. They're legally accessible, and they're more accessible than any other resource in this country, in any sector. You can get access to them more easily than anything else. They were developed by communities, and we're now collaborating with other communities of educators and students to expand into other subjects. We're working on life sciences, mathematical literacy, and it's going really well. People are fundamentally changing their perspective. Not only do we help these communities write books by collaborating with them effectively, they take ownership of it. It's a resource that they can take and change, adapt, contextualize later to their own specific needs, delivering a more relevant learning experience in their specific classroom that has technology integrated into it. And there are steps that we can take to make it even more exciting. Things like citizen cyber science projects. It's possible to participate in science experiments online as a real person doing data analysis, projects like TEDxRhodesU, Planet Hunters, etc. Learners in South Africa could actually make discoveries as part of NASA science experiments. That's really exciting. And it's doing real science. It's not a PR exercise, it's not a simulation. And we see this much bigger picture of establishing a community that has cutting-edge science, teachers, every other stakeholder that produces much more relevant and openly licensed educational resources for use in our classrooms. And that's busy happening. So our next endeavor is to prove that we can do this sustainably. The next impossible thing we want to do is build a sustainable social enterprise based on open educational resources. Out of the Shuttleworth Foundation, we've spun a project, or now a company, called Siyavula. Siyavula is an Nguni word. It means we are opening. So Siyavula Education is our company. It's a social enterprise, targets the education sector, but not just the high end, the full market. It works in collaboration with all stakeholders to develop all of the resources that are openly available and as accessible as possible. It's partly foundation owned. Any success that we have feeds back into the same innovative social investment model that made Siyavula possible in the first place. And we want to prove that we can drive an open educational resources agenda in a sustainable way as a social enterprise. And that's something else that everyone says is impossible, but we think we're on the cusp of making that happen as well. So I've learned that people think things are impossible, and the more people think things are impossible, the more just entrenched they are in the status quo, which is quite sad. Education has a significant number of challenges, but by collaborating with communities, we can make significant impact. And people exceed their own expectations of themselves when they work in a real community with mutual respect and purpose. We've seen them do amazing things. Educators come together, they sacrifice their weekends, and at the end of it, they've learned from each other, they're energized, they're excited, and they've exceeded what they thought they could do. They worked much harder and produced much more of material of higher quality than they thought possible. That's really exciting. So I'm convinced that we can revolutionize education in South Africa, so nationally, and ultimately globally, by embracing this openness, technology, and community for the production of educational resources. Thank you.